Picture this. You've got a philosopher, utterly convinced of his own brilliance, so sure of his ideas that even when his big book, his masterpiece, sells a measly 200 copies over 30 years, he doesn't budge, doesn't waver one bit. It's baffling, right? And that's Arthur Schopenhauer for you. And today, we're diving deep into this very paradox. How did this guy, initially met with blank stares, even ridiculed, become a sort of hidden force shaping how we think today?
It's a great question, and thankfully we've got this exploration of his life and work simply titled Schopenhauer. And through it, what we're trying to do is figure out how this figure, this guy who toiled in obscurity, planted seeds that would later have this huge impact in psychology, literature, you name it. So think of this as your cheat sheet, listener. We're pulling out the core of why Schopenhauer still matters today, giving you the good stuff without drowning you in all the philosophical jargon. So where does this unexpected journey begin?
Well, it all starts in 1788 in Danzig, now Gdańsk, Poland. What were the early influences that shaped young Schopenhauer?
You know, his early life is really a story of two contrasting worlds. On one hand, you've got his father, a successful practical merchant, totally immersed in the world of business and trade. And then complete contrast, his mother, she was a novelist, a vibrant intellectual who hosted these salons packed with thinkers and writers. So right from the start, he's exposed to both the down-to-earth realities of life and the pull of intellectual pursuits.
Sounds like a real push and pull.
Yeah.
And then a major turning point. His father's death. The source even suggests it might have been suicide. How did this event change things for Arthur?
Oh, it was a defining moment, without a doubt. You know, beyond the potential psychological impact of such a loss, especially if it was suicide, as the source implies, his father's death had this very practical consequence. It freed him from this expectation of following in his father's footsteps, taking over the family business. And with that freedom, he could finally dive into philosophy, a path that clearly held a deep fascination for him. But this liberation from one path led him down another, riddled with its own set of challenges.
Those challenges seem to be especially pronounced with his mother. Their relationship, it doesn't come across as very supportive. The source even mentions she mocked his philosophical ambitions. But you think, how many groundbreaking ideas have been crushed simply because those closest to us, they just didn't get it?
It's a really interesting point. And in Schopenhauer's case, it wasn't just, lighthearted teasing or anything. It seems to have been this constant and pretty harsh dismissal of his dreams. Imagine, you're pouring your heart and soul into these intellectual pursuits, only to have your own mother, a novelist herself, someone who should, understand the value of intellectual work, shoot you down. So you've got this young man possibly still reeling from his father's death. And then he's facing ridicule from his own mother for wanting to pursue the very thing he feels drawn to.
Right. He perseveres. In 1818, he publishes The World as Will and Representation. And this is where his really unconventional core idea takes center stage. What's this whole thing about the will that sets him apart?
Basically, Schopenhauer argued that underlying everything, even ourselves, there's this blind, irrational, constantly striving force that he calls the will. It's like this underlying unconscious urge that fuels all our desires and actions. But, and here's the key, this will is never truly satisfied. It's like as soon as you achieve one desire, another one pops up, leading to this never-ending cycle of wanting and ultimately suffering. So it's a pretty radical shift from the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and progress that was, dominating thought at the time.
And it's a pretty bleak outlook compared to the sunny optimism of the Enlightenment. So
yeah,
how did this rather pessimistic view go down with the intellectual circles of his time?
Not well at all. It was largely ignored by critics, and probably the biggest blow was the outright rejection from Hegel, who was like the philosophical rock star of the era. Schopenhauer even tried to, steal some of Hegel's thunder by scheduling his own university lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's, hoping to lure some students away.
Oh, wow, that's a bold move, but clearly didn't quite work out. The source mentions this interesting journal entry Schopenhauer wrote about the 3 stages of truth. What do you say about that?
Oh, it's a fascinating peek into his mindset. He writes, truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. It's almost like he's describing his own experience, his ideas being laughed at, then dismissed, but he's so sure that eventually they'll be recognized as simply true.
Almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it seems those early decades were pretty rough. The source mentions a long period of obscurity, even some legal battles.
It was a tough time, no doubt. He wasn't getting any recognition in the academic world. His books weren't selling. And on top of that, he had these personal struggles. There was this lawsuit with his neighbor, which ended with him having to pay her a pension for the rest of her life. It must have been a constant financial burden and a public embarrassment. So you can see he's not just fighting intellectual indifference, but also these very real everyday hardships.
Yet he kept going, kept refining his philosophical ideas. Makes you wonder, what keeps someone going when they're faced with that level of rejection year after year?
That's the big question, isn't it? It probably points to this deep inner conviction, this feeling that he had stumbled upon some fundamental truth, and it didn't matter if people weren't ready for it yet. It had to be, put out there. There's a certain tenacity, maybe even a little bit of, arrogance, some might say, but ultimately a real dedication to what he believed in.
So after decades in the wilderness, the source points to this phoenix moment around 1851 when he publishes Parerga and Paralipomena. What changed? What triggered this sudden shift in his fortunes?
It's a remarkable turnaround. At 63, he'd probably resigned himself to a life of obscurity, but then this glowing review came from a British critic, John Oxenford, who called Schopenhauer the most radical thinker since Kant. And that single positive review, it's amazing how it acted like a spark igniting interest in his work all across Europe.
So a single voice can sometimes make all the difference. And then the source drops some serious names, Nietzsche, Freud, even Einstein. What were their connections to Schopenhauer's thinking?
These connections they're the real proof of his lasting influence. Nietzsche, he was a big fan of Schopenhauer early on, deeply influenced by his ideas, although he later went in his own direction, especially with his idea of the will to power. And then you've got Freud, who actually credited Schopenhauer with foreshadowing his own discoveries about the unconscious mind and how it shapes our behavior. And then, get this, even Einstein, a giant in a totally different field, he supposedly kept Schopenhauer's books close by. It suggests there was something in Schopenhauer's thinking that resonated even with him. So you see, these initially dismissed ideas, they really infiltrated the intellectual world.
So why the delayed success? What was it about the mid-19th century that made people suddenly receptive to his rather bleak view of suffering after, decades of ignoring him?
The source offers a pretty compelling explanation. It argues that the social and political turmoil of the mid-19th century, all the changes brought about by industrialization, made people more aware of the darker side of things. So Schopenhauer's, his pessimism, his unflinching focus on the pain that's inherent in life, it probably resonated more with people who were grappling with all this rapid change and uncertainty.
Yeah.
It was like the world had finally caught up to his diagnosis of the human condition.
Like the world had finally caught up. Now, the source doesn't shy away from Schopenhauer's flaws. He was a controversial figure, held some pretty problematic views. Why is it important to acknowledge these contradictions when we talk about his legacy?
It's crucial because it reminds us that even the most brilliant minds are still human, still flawed. If we try to present some sanitized version of Schopenhauer, we're ignoring important parts of his thinking, like his views on women or even his personal inconsistencies, preaching one thing but living another. By acknowledging his flaws, we can engage with his ideas more honestly, appreciating the insights, but also recognizing his limitations. It makes for a more nuanced and ultimately a more truthful understanding of his work.
So let's dig into that core concept, the will, as this insatiable force. Can you elaborate on how Schopenhauer saw this will as something that basically enslaves us?
He saw the will as this relentless, unconscious drive that's constantly pushing us to fulfill our desires. But the catch is, this fulfillment is always temporary, like an illusion. You satisfy one desire and boom, another one pops up and you're trapped in this endless cycle of striving and dissatisfaction. It's like we become puppets to this inner force, forever chasing fleeting moments of pleasure that never really bring lasting peace. And that's what he meant by the will enslaving us. We're never truly free from its demands.
But the source does talk about the possibility of liberation, of recognizing these chains, so to speak. How did Schopenhauer envision us breaking free from this cycle, even if just for a moment?
That's where his philosophy offers a path, though it's not an easy one. He believed that by becoming aware of the nature of the will, by seeing how we're ruled by it, we could start to detach ourselves from its grip. And he saw certain things as offering a temporary escape. Art, especially music and poetry, allowed for a contemplation of the underlying will without being, directly driven by its desires. Compassion, by shifting the focus to the suffering of others, could help weaken the ego and that intense focus on our own needs. And finally, self-mastery, consciously trying to control our impulses and desires. That was a key element in this potential liberation.
It's interesting that he finds this potential for freedom not just in rational thought, but also in these more emotional realms like art and compassion. The source even asks if our greatest weakness could hold the key to something greater. What's the thinking behind that?
It's a really intriguing idea. Schopenhauer himself was a complicated guy, full of contradictions. Maybe his own struggles, his own inconsistencies are what fueled the intensity of his philosophical exploration. The idea is that by really facing our flaws, the desires that drive those flaws, or so-called weaknesses, we can gain this deeper understanding of ourselves and the human condition, and this self-awareness. It can then be channeled into creativity, into empathy, so those weaknesses, they become sources of strength, sources of unique insight.
So moving on to his lasting impact. The source draws some clear connections to modern psychology, Freud's id, Jung's collective unconscious. How do these ideas reflect Schopenhauer's thinking?
The parallels are pretty striking. Freud's id, that primal, instinctual part of the psyche that operates mostly unconsciously, driven by basic desires, it's very similar to Schopenhauer's will. Both represent this powerful, non-rational force that's behind so much of our behavior. And similarly, Jung's collective unconscious, this shared pool of universal experiences and archetypes that shape our individual psychology, it echoes Schopenhauer's idea of this fundamental will that goes beyond individual consciousness and shapes human experience at a deeper level. So you see Schopenhauer's insights into the non-rational parts of the mind. They really anticipated some major developments in 20th century psychology.
And his impact wasn't limited to psychology. The source also mentions his influence on literature, figures like Tolstoy and Kafka. What kind of themes did they pick up from Schopenhauer?
They were especially drawn to his pessimism, his view of human existence as inherently full of suffering, and the idea that all this striving, it's ultimately futile. You see these themes of alienation, the absurdity of life, characters wrestling with their desires, both internal and external, recurring in their work. So Schopenhauer provided this philosophical framework for exploring these darker, more challenging aspects of the human condition in a really profound and artistically compelling way.
Even today, the source argues his ideas are relevant to discussions about artificial intelligence, not a connection most people would make right away. How does Schopenhauer fit into the world of AI?
It comes down to thinking about the fundamental drives behind intelligent systems. As we create more and more sophisticated AI, we have to ask questions about their motivations, their goals, even if those goals are purely algorithmic. Schopenhauer's focus on these underlying forces, often non-rational, that drive human behavior, it gives us a new lens to look at the development of AI and its potential implications. It makes us think, what if even advanced technology is driven by something like a programmed will to achieve certain outcomes? And what does that mean for us?
In the end, the source boils down his perspective on life to this pretty stark statement. A pendulum between pain and boredom. Not exactly uplifting, but there's an honesty to it. What's the potential power in acknowledging this reality?
The power lies in acceptance. By acknowledging the inherent difficulties, the fact that desire and dissatisfaction are cyclical, as Schopenhauer describes, maybe we can stop expecting constant happiness and find moments of peace in the spaces between those inevitable periods of struggle. It's about recognizing a fundamental truth about being human instead of fighting against it or feeling disappointed when perfect happiness proves elusive.
So the deep dive ends with this direct call to action for you, our listener, posing Schopenhauer's central challenge. Will you conform or will you create? And it lays out 3 specific actions. Let's break those down. First, name your will. What's the idea behind consciously identifying a desire, maybe an unconscious one, that's driving a negative habit?
It goes right to the heart of Schopenhauer's concept of the will as this hidden force shaping our actions. By really pinpointing a negative habit, you're bringing that underlying desire that maybe you weren't even aware of before into the light of consciousness. And this act of naming it, making it conscious, that's the first step towards understanding its power over you and maybe starting to weaken its grip.
Second, create to liberate. How can channeling pain or frustration into something creative offer a kind of freedom from this will?
Schopenhauer saw art as this unique way to transcend the suffering caused by the will's constant striving. By taking those raw emotions, those feelings of pain or frustration, and turning them into something creative, whether it's writing, music, painting, whatever, you're expressing them, giving them form, and in a way, gaining control over them. It's a way to find meaning, even beauty, in suffering, and to step outside the immediate demands of the will, even if just for a while.
And lastly, embrace the fight.
Mm.
The source reminds us of Schopenhauer's own decades of being ignored, of not being recognized. What's the message there for someone trying to forge their own path, especially if it's an unconventional one?
The message is about perseverance, about believing in yourself, even when it's tough. Schopenhauer faced ridicule, neglect for decades, but he never wavered in his belief in his ideas. And remembering his story, the fact that his masterpiece initially sold so poorly, it can be encouraging when you're facing your own doubts, when others don't get what you're doing. It reminds us that truly original, truly impactful work, it might not always be immediately understood or appreciated.
A good reminder that forging your own path often means dealing with uncertainty, even rejection. The deep dive wraps up by reiterating that core message. Schopenhauer's life is a powerful example of how suffering can be transformed into profound insight.
It really is. He took his own personal struggles, his feelings of alienation, of disillusionment, and he turned them into this philosophical system that still sparks debate and resonates with people centuries later. It shows us that adversity, when you face it honestly and keep going, it can be a catalyst for something truly great.
And the final lesson. Adversity can be a catalyst for greatness, a reminder that we get to choose how we respond to the challenges that life throws our way. The source then quotes Schopenhauer. The task is not to see what has never been seen, but to think what has never been thought about that which everyone sees. What is the wisdom in that for us today?
It's about the power of perspective, of thinking for yourself. Schopenhauer wasn't necessarily discovering brand new things, but he was offering this radically different and often uncomfortable way of interpreting human experience, the things that drive us, the very nature of reality. He's encouraging us to look beyond the surface, beyond what seems obvious, and to question those assumptions we often take for granted.
So his defiance, his commitment to his own unique vision, even when everyone was telling him he was wrong, it can be a sort of compass for navigating the world, as the source puts it.
Exactly. His willingness to stand apart, to articulate his own perspective, even when it went against the mainstream, it's inspiring for anyone who feels like an outsider or whose ideas aren't immediately embraced. It's a reminder to trust your own insights and to have the courage to think differently, even when it means, going against the grain.
And it all leads to this final thought-provoking question. The world still bends to the will. But in every act of courage, in every moment of clarity, we shatter its grip. Schopenhauer's fire burns in you now. What will you do with it? A powerful way to end our deep dive into the surprisingly relevant legacy of Arthur Schopenhauer.